Good afternoon. We're going to call this meeting to order. Let's all rise for the Pledge of Allegiance. Ready? Begin. Pledge allegiance. Flag. United States. We'll roll call, starting Jerry. Devin Aviles.
Jared Samarin.
Public comment, item number 4. The first 15 minutes of each regular session is set aside for members of the public to comment on any item within the jurisdiction of the committee, but not appearing on the agenda. For items appearing on the agenda, the public is invited to comment at the time the item is called for consideration by the committee. Any person addressing the committee under public comment will be limited to a 3-minute presentation to ensure that all interested parties have an opportunity to speak. Please submit any handouts to the recording secretary. Do we have any public comments? Seeing none, we will move on to item number 5, demand management options and recommendation. Regan and Stephanie and Agneson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We're going to give you a short presentation, and we're going to pass it remote back and forth between the three of us.
And Stephanie, just one comment before. I would respectfully ask the committee, let's get through the entire presentation before we ask any questions.
Thank you. So I wanted to start with a saying and an expression. It's not quite showing on the screen, full screen, so I'll read it to you. This is from Gary Peterson from the Salinas Valley Basin GSAs. He's their general manager. I've run into him a couple times at the AWWA conference, and then I saw him at the Groundwater Resources Association Summit. And I think he characterized Sigma really accurately, which is what everybody wants is predictability and certainty. And what we all get, unpredictability and uncertainty. And the way forward is through trust and transparency and legitimate stakeholder processes that include all beneficial users. So I thought these were some good words of wisdom to guide our discussions this afternoon. Okay, we're going to talk through 3 things that we've touched on before. We're going to go into a little bit more detail though. We have projects, demand reduction, and then rates. And we're actually going to do a little bit of legal analysis. Deputy County Counsel Mike Linden is going to provide some legal analysis of a couple famous water rates cases at the end. Okay, I'm passing this over to Greg for the next chunk of the presentation.
Good afternoon, Chair, members of the committee. Let's see. So we're going to talk about projects again, just to kind of touch on things, highlight the fact that the Madera County GSAs, again, primarily thinking of Chowchilla and Madera subbasins, do include projects, and that is important, and working towards trying to find projects that can help us out here besides just demand reduction. So just a couple of pretty pictures of the idea of flood mar, which is talked about, and the idea of recharge basins. So just trying to make us all feel good, right? Get water out there. The projects, primarily, we got to look at things, and I kind of categorize them these 3 ways here. The sources of water, and generally we have the potential for CVP Section 215 water, maybe some other provisions under CVP contracts to get some water into the white areas. We can purchase water from others, whether that's CVP water, whether that's water rights water somebody has, whether that's in this area, whether that's coming somewhere else in exchange through Millerton or something. There's purchasing water from somewhere else. And then there's pursuing new water rights where it might be high flows on the Chowchilla bypass, for example, or some other things. And then locations for either direct or in lieu recharge, we kind of have, again, thinking of the east area with water conveyed via the Madera Canal and MID or Chowchilla Water District laterals, which would require agreements, obviously, with both of those or either of those parties in order to do any conveyance. They'd have to have capacity, be willing to wheel that water. And then over on the west area with water diverted more from the Chowchilla bypass or East Side bypass delivered to more of the bottom end, either to the bottom end of the MID and Chowchilla laterals or via streams or diverted from the bypass. So that basically, the west area could be served possibly from a couple different places. The east area really can only be accessed off the Madera Canal in order to recharge them. That was kind of what the point of that bullet was. Then methods, we have recharge ponds. We have something called flood-mar, and that's flood managed aquifer recharge. That's a term of art that the Department of Water Resources is pushing heavily, and in fact has a new division within the state that's called the flood-mar division. And Stephanie and I actually met with them recently and are trying to pursue some work with them to have them help us find what we can do, get some projects on the ground, do some technical analysis, other things. And dry wells and in lieu irrigation. So that's kind of the methods of getting water into the ground and those pathways. Some pros and cons about projects. Obviously, the pros of projects are supplemental to the native groundwater, and they can offset a small portion of the demand reduction we need to do. The cons, they require significant infrastructure that in many cases does not really exist yet, or we need to rely on others who have that capacity, and only when they have that capacity available to make, to possibly wheel water for us. Supplies are intermittent. A lot of the supplies you could get access to, even under new water rights, are going to be intermittent. The benefits may be limited to certain areas in the GSAs, obviously with recharge basins or flood-mar or other things. It's probably going to be in certain areas, and how that actually translates to other parts of the basin are some of the limitations of that. So anyway, just some listings of pros and cons to think about. Our focus, more discussion today again, is on demand reduction. So we just wanted to touch on a couple of things broadly to we're kind of resetting the stage a little bit for the conversation that we expect to then have for the rest of this time up here today. And wanted to start off with a couple of points of relevant regulatory sections from the Code of Regulations that outlines or actually defines what we have to have in the groundwater sustainability plan. Timer, am I up? Is that my 3 minutes? Section 354.44, paragraph 2, if overdraft conditions are identified, the plan shall describe projects or management actions, including a quantification of demand reduction or other methods for the mitigation of overdraft. So this is just, again, a notation, and we'll look at the numbers here in a minute as a reminder that you're required to quantify demand reduction if that's part of your management actions. And that's what we've done, and that's what we're talking about, is how do we do that over time, and how do we get there? And then the other thing that I think is notable and important is under 354.26b3 that talks about undesirable results. The part of your description of undesirable results should talk about the potential effects on the beneficial uses and users of groundwater, on land uses and property interests, and other potential effects. So essentially, this is saying the economy matters. That's what this indicates, which is what kind of goes back to the idea of the glide path we've talked about before, with an approximate annual reduction that's maybe a little flatter earlier and then a little steeper or consistent or whatever it is. That it's kind of premised in this part of the regulation, which says you can consider these uses. You don't have to just pull the rug out from underneath, as we're trying to put something forward here. So now let's, as a reminder, and I think we have to remind ourselves to maybe use a different, not the wide format on these PowerPoints in the future, because these just keep coming off the page. The Madera Subbasin County GSA has a 2040 goal of getting to about 90,000 acre feet less use, which is about a 3,500 to 5,500 incremental addition each year to get there. And so when we look at on the screen here, this is the incremental add. So the blue line is going from no reduction to about, what you can't see over here is this is 90,000. So this number in 2040 is we've reduced by about 90,000. This is a percentage of ET going from 100% ET to about 60, a little over 60% of the current baseline ET. So that's what that graph is trying to show. In the Chowchilla Basin, the goal is about 28,000 acre-feet less use, ranging at about 1,500 to 3,500 incremental add each year as you go up this slope here. So that's just kind of a refresher about the magnitudes we're talking about, trying to deal with. The current options for demand reduction, and Stephanie and I and Mike have talked about this a bunch, of trying to make sure it's understood that there isn't a one solution we have to necessarily put in place. These things can be combined, and maybe there can be adaptive over time. The key is we need to be able to be making progress on that demand reduction in the overall GSAs. So the couple of strategies we mentioned here aren't to try and illustrate them as independent and exclusive, but rather concepts that can be merged in different ways, may adapt over time. So the three strategies, again, were the allocation at the parcel level, and we talked about different allocation methods and various things, and we discussed that at the 17th and the 23rd meetings, so the most recent discussions. The idea of water markets have been brought up at various meetings, and an idea about easements, which we've talked a little bit about. That's really weird. The pointer just buzzed on me. Yeah, like that. Easements, ideas of some sort of rentals for annual rentals or multi-year rentals or in perpetuity rentals that would remove consumptive use of groundwater from the basin as part of a way to get to that incremental chunk we're getting at each year. So let's talk a little bit about the pros and cons of these, just again to set up to help us think about this for discussions. Allocations, so managed based on known conditions. You have an allocation either in various ways. We talked about it either by crop or by parcel or in a variety of ways we've looked at it. So those, you kind of have some knowns there. The cons, there's various challenges to the administration of that. Depending on how those allocations were to be set, they can be more or less administratively difficult. The allocations are set by the GSA. So that's kind of like a little bit of government control in contrast to one of the other discussions or some of the other parts we'll talk about a little bit. Complexity associated with setting the allocations, as we had fairly rigorous conversations the last couple meetings about how to try and set that, whether it's by crop type, irrigated crop lands versus non-irrigated, whether there's carryover, whether there's markets, there's all this stuff. So there's a lot of complexities to those kind of allocations things. Water markets, a couple of pros on those, might be a little more cost effective because you're letting the market actually work out who's getting the water and how that's moving around rather than, and maybe from a cost perspective, it's more cost effective from the county's operations standpoint. I don't know if it's necessarily more or less cost effective from a grower's perspective. Added grower flexibility, we think, might be there under the market concepts. Again, these can layer, so allocations with markets can work. Markets on their own can potentially work in some manners. There's independent choices, and there's probably less government control over market strategy rather than having the government kind of dole it out. You're kind of trying to let the market manage that. Cons, there is an allocation element that you'd have to try and identify in some way because you need to know what you have before you can start to try and market that around. It is administratively difficult to make sure it's all being tracked, and it could allow for things like water speculation, right, where people are just buying a property or something to be able to capture and hoard and then resell water at profits. Maybe not on any of those things, right? So let's go to easements. Pros could be flexibility because they might allow you to do maybe a 1-year or a 5-year easement on a parcel. So maybe you're going to take some land out of production, some trees or vines or something are getting to the end of their productive life, and you're going to take them out and rest that land for a while. And so you go ahead and enter into an agreement to not pump and grow anything on that land, at least that would require any groundwater for some period of time. And you would kind of have then guaranteed demand reduction. The cons, which get into one of the other issues here, is that you need to make sure we're getting the net reduction we need to do every year, and it's growing over time to get to those bigger buckets. Because you could see, hey, I'm going to take this land out of production, and someone's going to pay me to take this land out of production, and I go turn around and turn some other land into higher, heavier production. The overall net use of groundwater doesn't go down. So we'd have to consider that. It may be less cost effective because it might be fairly, depending on where the economics play out, may be expensive to try and get people to not get enough people to not grow, to pay them to basically not grow. Temporary rentals don't guarantee water savings that build over time, so we'd have to keep adding new temporaries to replace ones that are coming off, and as well as expanding so that we're getting to those large demand reductions. And there's potential economic impacts may come sooner when you're taking some land out of production. And let's see, so where am I? I'm on the easements. So then a couple other ideas just to toss out there. Contests, highest yield with least water consumption type contests. Actually read about this. I saw it on something that's happening out in Nebraska, I think, where they're doing combinations of yield and water use, and they were making large monetary benefits to the winners. So people were experimenting and we're learning how to be able to produce high yield with less actual consumptive use, not just less pumping, not becoming just more efficient, but actually less consumptive use while still maintaining yields. And so they're putting, tens of thousands of dollars of prize money and meters and a variety of things. They got the commodity markets were involved, soybean or I think the soybean markets were involved in doing this. And so there's some ideas there. We could get creative and try and find ways to help reduce that consumption. Studies to look at what might be lower water using crops that could have economic viability. What can be done to help promote different new ideas out there and new production? How can those, are they commodities that may need some support with marketing and et cetera? Other ideas that might be a little more out there in how people may react are things like land use restrictions and well moratoriums. But those are, again, other ideas that we can just throw out there as possibilities of trying to manage the demand reduction. Finally, I think the last slide I was going to touch on before we get into rates considerations are things for you guys to consider here where we're talking through what I know we'll have some conversations about here the rest of today. That's the administrative regulatory burden for the grower, the administrative burden for the county GSA, the economics, whether it's the individual grower's economics, whether it's the county GSA economics, or whether it's the county as a whole. Because recognizing the county as a whole also has other GSAs that are in different situations, like Madera Irrigation District in the Madera Basin and Chowchilla Water District in the Chowchilla Basin have significant surface water resources. So the economics there are a little different than what might be in the county GSA part. Flexibility and adaptability of approach to modify to make sure our targets are being met. I want you to think about that. So some ideas we could maybe implement something for the first several years and then roll and transition to something else. So again, some things to kind of plan in our head as we're having some conversations. So now we're going to hand the mic over to Mike to talk about rates. All right, do I have one more? Oh, these are for you again. Sorry, not to Mike yet. My bad.
So I'm going to review our current rate strategy, and we've talked through this a couple of times, but I wanted you to see it in a slide just so you know how we're moving ahead with this. So the county does have a flood control and water conservation district and agency. It is countywide, not just the county GSA. It is one person and $150,000 a year. It is responsible for maintaining somewhere between 150 and 200 miles worth of levees on the Fresno River and both sloughs. It also has responsibilities for clearing culverts and all sorts of things that it does on this budget. So that there's some lakes in the mountains too. Yeah, it has heavy duty responsibilities, and it needs to move ahead with some sort of fee for people. So what we are doing is we're assessing what those fees might need to be, because our entire strategy under Sigma relies on harnessing flood flows. So we need to be able to harness them and keep them in the channels so that they are not flooding and risking lives and property. So this is a pretty serious thing, and we're going to share at the Board of Supervisors on June 16th. Preliminary results from a study. So you may want to tune in for that. That will be at a normal 10 a.m. Board of Supervisors meeting. I'm sorry, July 16th. So that's kind of step one. And I see this as a baseline for all work under Sigma, is getting control of flood flows. Then step two, we have the ability to do a fee, which is exempt under Prop 26, and this runs the county GSA. And this can do all of the planning studies that we need in terms of where to do recharge, water rights permits, all sorts of CEQA. This can fund that. So that's our second step. So we have a rate consultant for step one and a different one for step two. Those are hired, they're under contract with the county, and they're working on this. Step three is more complicated, and that is to say, to build large-scale infrastructure or to purchase a large contract supply, for example, with something like Sites Reservoir, we would have to go through a 218 process that would take it out for a vote of the public. So that isn't the sort of thing we can do this year. That needs a rate study that goes along with it. And Mike is going to talk a little bit more about some famous within the water industry rate cases, just so that you're kind of informed of the issues that come up with rates.
Thank you, Stephanie, and Chair Aviles and members of the committee. Yes, we have a couple of cases we want to discuss very generally tonight. The first one here is a water rate case that, from a perspective, thank you, of a municipal purveyor, the city of San Juan Capistrano. The case is called Capistrano Taxpayers Association, Inc. versus City of San Juan Capistrano. I believe this case was either 2015 or 2015, so it's very, very recent case. Here, yes, we have a municipal water rate structure, which, admittedly would be a little bit different than what we would do as a GSA, but still, the subject of tiered rates is looked at pretty seriously in this case. And so what you have is a basic tiered rate structure where at so much use it would be at one rate, and then if you used more water, it would be at a higher rate, and so on and so forth. And then suit was brought, and the basic takeaways from this case, one is that water rates must reflect the cost of service attributable to a given parcel. Okay, that's a basic concept. And so if you have tiered rates, what you need is that the tiers must correspond to the actual cost of providing the service at that particular given level of use. And so what that means is, if you are providing at a certain tier, say a tier 3 or tier 4, well, it cannot be just for, well, we want to influence the usage, and if we have higher rates, then people might use less. Well, that's not a sufficient justification. It has to correspond to the actual cost of providing the service at that rate, which is a very detailed an analysis that here the city couldn't even do and really didn't even try to do. And so you cannot allocate costs among the tiers based on some sort of predetermined usage budget. One thing that you'll need to know is it does not prohibit tiered rates. It just makes them much more difficult to justify. However, we still see tiered rates, common in the municipal rate structures. And so, but if you're going to be establishing them, you have to tie them to what's the cost of service at the higher rate. What does it cost us as a GSA to provide that? And another thing to note here for this case is tiered rates. What you see with them typically are Prop 218 proceedings, because they're municipal providers. They provide water services to particular parcels. Now, and so that's one thing about tiered rates, especially as we get into Sigma and we get into the water code. which if we're going to be doing any rates, like this post GSP, it requires a Prop 218 proceeding. It's a Water Code Section 10730.2. So, and go on to the next case. This is a case that's talked about quite a bit, especially with us as a GSA. All the GSAs talk about this case because you have a district here that's similar to a GSA. It's a water conservation district. This was the district that we actually went and visited a while back, and they certainly helped us out and showed us what we did on the subject of water markets. Well, they've had long-standing disputes with the adjacent city of San Buenaventura. In fact, part of the district actually crosses over, and so they've had litigation. This particular case goes back many, many, many years. And so the basics of it are, this is a water conservation district. It's a creature, conservation districts are a creature of statute, and this is one of them. And so they have rates. They're basic, pumping charges is what they're described as, pumping charges. And they're not tiered rates. They're uniform charges, but the rub here was that the state statutes require that the ratio be 3-to-1 for non-ag users. So they're charged 3 times as much. Included in non-ag users is the city. And so the case has a long history. There was actually a settlement agreement where the city was paying less than the 3-to-1 rate, but that settlement agreement ended. And as soon as it ended, well, the litigation started up anew. And that's where this case came up. The city made a number of arguments. One of the arguments was that, well, hey, these rates are property related. They are subject to Proposition 218. And the Court of Appeal found otherwise, as did the California Supreme Court. They're saying that these pumping charges, they are not property related because it's not the delivery of water to a particular parcel. It's more for the benefit of the public as a whole, which is, one could argue, somewhat akin to what we do here as a groundwater sustainability agency. And so there's certain things that do correspond to what we do. Well, one thing to note here, going back to the tiered rate analysis, is that these charges were mandated by statute. They were not tiered rates that were created by the district. In fact, the rates in the zones were actually uniform, except that for the non-ag, by statute, it went up to 3-to-1. What happened in this case, though, is that the matter was remanded back to the Court of Appeal on the issue of Proposition 26. What happened there was the city conceded that these pumping charges, they fell under either the service or product exception or the privilege or benefit exception to Prop 26. Prop 26 basically is everything is a tax except if it's exempt. Okay, so if it's under Prop 218, that's one of the exemptions. Well, we didn't have that here. So what are the other exemptions? Well, they found, well, maybe it's a service or product from the government, or maybe it's a privilege or benefit. Arguments can be made on both sides of that, but what happened here in the Supreme Court is that the city conceded that point. One could say that maybe they just didn't want to lose on it, but they felt that their better argument was that they did not analyze something else that's in Prop 26, which is it has to bear a fair or reasonable relationship to the payors, in this case the city, the payors' burdens on or benefits from the district's activities. Okay, so if you have to have a connection there to be exempt from the definition of a tax. So what does that mean? Well, that's why you need a good rate-making consultant, and that's why we will be engaging with such consultants with what we do in anything, whether it involves just a regulatory fee or something that requires a Prop 218 proceeding where you would have notice and then a majority protest. So basic legal takeaways here are, once again, tiered rates, are assumed to need a Proposition 218 proceeding. When I say assumed, it means all of the law that we have with tiered rates, including the San Juan Capistrano case, they come from purveyors where they have Prop 218 proceedings, okay? And plus, like mentioned before, Sigma, if you have a post-GSP fee, Sigma says that you will comply with the property-related fee or charge provisions of Proposition 218. And so whether we want to argue that, well, it's not property-related, well, Sigma says that this is what you do. And so we have to be cognizant of that when we go forward. Okay, so Prop 218, you're going to have notice and majority protest proceedings. They cannot be, the tiered rates cannot be explicitly utilized to change behavior. It cannot be the purpose of it. You have to be able to tie tier by tier to associated increasing costs. What those costs are, that is what a rate-making consultant is for. We can talk about things like, here we are a GSA. The more water is pumped, the more of a burden we have, but that has to be a very factually detailed analysis. And then obviously any rate studies need to be on very solid legal ground.
This concludes our presentation. We'd be glad to take any questions from you, especially Mike would like to ask if you have any detailed legal questions. He's here.
Okay.
Super detailed.
Thank you. And we'll go to committee comments. One thing before we do that, please, I went back and reviewed the last video, and it is important that when you speak, you do speak into the microphone, because otherwise on the videos, it cannot be heard. So for everybody that does want to watch these or review them. So with that, who would like to start with any questions or comments? Ralph?
Is it on? Mike, my question is this. I'm sure that the people that started this tier structure with the city and all this litigation went on, I'm sure they hired a lot of consultants too to put together that program, didn't they?
I imagine they did, but they did not, and nor did they even try to, let me go back to my notes, justify the fee as to, yes, we're providing at this tier, let's just say hypothetically tier 3, they never did try to justify the fee at that level as it costs us this much to provide service at this level. They never did that. What they later did was, I'm sure, hire a consultant to do just that.
They did it after the fact.
Well, they had to because the court.
Yeah. If we proceed to create some sort of a fee, would you say in generality that what we have to do is create a very fair fee that once the fee is assumed to be fair, or even it could be a fair fee and it's still not good enough?
The question of fairness is something that I'm not saying it's irrelevant, but the primary thing with the law is it has to be tied, one, to the level of service that you're providing, and also with fee law, it can't go beyond what it takes for us to provide the service. Otherwise, it's a tax. It can't have a windfall, in other words.
Okay, so when you do the fee then, can you have a fee structure that builds like a reserve in it for a future cost? How close does it have to be, the fee to the cost, year by year, or can it be over, say, 5 years?
Good you mentioned the subject of reserve, because actually Sigma this is Water Code Section 10730, the pre-GSP might be a regulatory fee, but it's something that a prudent reserve actually can be part of that fee. And so Sigma acknowledges that.
I would just add to that in the flood assessment, we are looking at what exactly a prudent reserve would be for us, because as you know, with flood, right, it could be nothing 1 year and a lot of repairs in another year. So you have to have a reserve of funds accessible for emergencies.
One thing that I'm worried about is this becoming more like an air pollution board or San Joaquin Valley Air. You guys all deal with them. We don't want to create an agency like that. it is horrible dealing with them. Absolutely the worst. They charge a bundle, and they have these engineers that get stuff approved. It takes forever. I waited over a year and a half for. I mean, that is ridiculous trying to get something. Now I can't say the county's just as fast, but I do worry about that. I'm hesitant to. Spending money is not my favorite, and then so you made a comment about a consultant to try to figure out a rate. I don't see there's a reason to hire someone to figure out a rate or thing that we need to approve anyways. I think we could work together and establish what's fair for us. Us being the farmers would know really that's going to conflict the industry than just in a so. You look like you're going to make a comment, Mike. Go ahead.
Sure. Just on that point, when it comes to any rate making, stakeholder outreach is an important thing, and it would be good to certainly gauge obviously the feelings out there in the public. It is not an irrelevant thing, but it also has to be tied back to the agency and what the costs of the agency are. So but many things are relevant.
So we want to figure out a fee that's going to pay for the person that's going to do the accounts payable or accounts receivable. Creating an agency like that is what like you want to create a Valley Air. They don't want that. So that's what you're proposing, right?
I don't think so. So I don't know a ton about what you're talking about in terms of the air control board, but all GSAs in California need fees in order to exist. There's a fair amount of typical tasks that we would have, including all of the planning work to do water rights to get the water that we need in order to comply with the plan. So those are things that cost money, and that's what the fee would be, which is step 2. But I think your point about figuring out a way around the rate consultant, I get that. I do, but I also think that there's a fair amount of expertise with the rate consultants that we deal with, where they could take something that was developed by this advisory committee and then figure out how to take the key pieces of it and make it legal and solid. So that's sort of a hybrid of as Mike was saying, a stakeholder approach plus the consultant, because rates are extremely litigious, water rates in California. You want to have something that's very, very solid, and you want to have someone who can explain every in and out of it. And typically the rate consultant can do that.
Engineers.
Well, it doesn't have to be an engineer.
Well, and I think,
Valley Air is.
well, Ben, I think to your point, though, it's not a matter if we're going to have to, if there's a fee or not. All that's coming. So,
It will be.
but I think there is, remember, the committee that we sit on is here to give recommendations to the board. So I think we will have input on controlling those costs and everything that goes out. So I think we as a group, as a committee, can make recommendations to the board that should allow us to limit those costs. Are you done, Ben?
I lost my train. I'll speak up again. Okay.
Bill?
Yeah, no, I'm concerned that we will try and base our decisions on what might or might not happen in the courts, because there's going to be lawsuits no matter what we do. So I think it's this committee's job to try and figure out what is going to be the least disruptive thing to do, and do that. And obviously, we aren't the final decision. We can give our input, but the Board of Supervisors and Council are going to make the final decision. I believe, like I always have and have been consistent, that the tiered rates can be couched in such a way that you can justify those rates, because those rates are going to be what quantitatively reduce our groundwater pumping. Not in a sense of discouraging pumping, but in a sense of incentivizing growers who are row cropping to fallow their land and reduce pumping. And I've got to apologize because I am absolutely stuck on that idea that growers have got to be incentivized to retire land, and the way you're going to do that is with dollars that are generated through pumping. Now, that rate study, each one of us up here has a different idea of what the value of water is, as does everybody in the audience. The value of water in 10 years, there is nobody in this room that can imagine what the value of water is in 10 years. I just believe that we need to incentivize reduced pumping, and those rates can be justified by studying how much money it's going to take to hand over to grower X to not plant that 40 acres of corn. So I'm going to have more to say, but I'm going to leave someone else on the committee comment, and hopefully we may get a chance to come around again.
Kevin?
Thanks, Devin. Mike, a question for you. I don't know if there's a difference or not, but you're saying that when it's tiered as per 218, that takes a vote.
Yes, with tiered rates, they're typically done, what we've seen with the court cases, they're done by municipal purveyors who provide services to particular parcels where obviously the rates are there, it's all out front. And so they're typically passed with a Prop 218 proceeding, which will be obviously notice and then majority protest proceeding. But one thing about water service, it doesn't take the subsequent voter ratification, because there's an exception to it in Prop 218 law.
Okay, so where I'm going with this is, if we say if you pump less than an acre foot, your tax is going to be $50 an acre. If you're pumping 1 to 2 acre feet, it's $100 an acre, and so on. To me, that's obviously a tiered pricing system. But my question is, what if we don't do it by how much acre feet you pump, but if you do it by crop? If you just said almonds are going to pay $300 an acre, pistachios are going to pay $200 an acre, et cetera, is that still considered tier pricing?
Not as I understand it. That would be a different type of system.
So perhaps that's a way around this fee without having to put it to a vote?
Well, I said that would have to be, I have not seen any example of that before.
Okay.
To where one rate for one crop and another rate for another crop. I could say it somewhat smacks of a tiered rate, but it is a little different from the classic definition of it.
Well, I guess my suggestion is, if you think it maybe has merit, that's perhaps something we should look into. That's question one. Question two is, I've been struggling, I suspect others have as well, with if you're on native pasture and you have not been pumping any water, should you be able to get a pumping credit or allocation that you could sell or trade? And I'm not sure I want to suggest this. I just wanted to throw it out there for consideration. Maybe a way around that is those folks would also, if they wanted to be eligible, then they would also have to pay this fee, whatever that looks like. So that way, in other words, if you want to be able to sell your half an acre foot pumping credit and you're on native pasture, and you think you could sell it for $250 an acre a year, Well, you're going to have to contribute whatever that fee is to the county to help to pay for the infrastructure and the maintenance costs. Just two suggestions.
Jim. So we had the three strategies that you presented. Is it your expectation? I mean, you led off by saying that we're trying to quantify the demand reduction, which is certainly devoted several meetings to that. And we have these three strategies you propose to accomplish that. Is it the charge of this committee to also recognize how to substantiate that reduction in the future and how to enforce it? And do we need to be considering, as we look at the three strategies, do we need to be considering which of those can be practically substantiated and reasonably enforced?
Yes, to first of all, again, they're not mutually exclusive, and there may be combinations, like for instance, just complete hypothetical, just to have conversations about ideas here. Let's say you have some sort of fee structure. We'll take Herman's suggestion that it's just by crop, right? And that generates a pool of money that you use to help buy down demand from some people. But you're also layering in some sort of allocation aspect that has maybe a market rate associated with it, and there's some trading. So that kind of encompasses all three of those things, right? So there's various ways to try and look at that. All of that, ultimately, we're reporting to the state, both as the GSA and in combination with the other GSAs on behalf of the entire subbasin. We need to show that we are moving in the direction of sustainability. And this GSA's portion of its actions to meet sustainability, besides trying to do some recharge and new water projects, is a major demand reduction chunk. And we're going to need to be able to demonstrate that. So there is going to need to be some sort of monitoring and enforcement strategies to make sure that if collectively we're not seeing a 3,500 in the Madera subbasin, again as an example, 35 to 5,500 acre foot added increment each year. So we're 5 years down the road, we need to be 20,000 acre feet less than a 2015 baseline. If we're not showing that kind of movement in some manner, we're going to need to up everything to get there, right? Which means either higher fees to try and somehow tied to that is a service because we're using that to build more projects, or however we want to try and tell the legal story. You're going to have to generate more money, which might result in paying more people or charging more, and people make different economic decisions at the grower level of how much they want to grow when the pumping costs start to go up. So monitoring and enforcement is going to have to happen, and there's going to have to be a feedback loop, and that's why the adaptation concepts have to be considered in this. So I don't think we should, when you guys are making recommendations to the board ultimately of how to try and do this, again, we're discussing from the GSA perspective, we have this bucket that we need to start getting smaller and smaller. How that gets managed, we're asking for your input and thoughts, and we want a recommendation to take forward to the county board of supervisors. And then we're going to have to start, after this GSP is into the state, we're going to need to be implementing those things that start building that structure, whether it is a initial 5-year kind of here's what we're going to do, or if it right off the bat we're going to take path X and then transition to path Y or some combination thereof. There is no right answer other than we got to see this incremental reduction occurring on the entirety of the basin. So I don't know if that got to your question specifically, but
Yeah, I think I'm just looking back to our earliest meetings when we, there seemed to be quite a bit of support for the concept. We're just going to tell everybody they got to reduce 2% a year. As a practical matter, it's unenforceable. I mean, the administrative load of trying to substantiate to the state that everybody was cutting back 2% a year strikes me as nearly impossible, as opposed to, say, strategy 3, where we're coming in and saying, okay, state, here's 3,500 acres or 1,700 acres that we took out of production. We met the goal.
And yes, I would agree with that latter point that you could point to, here's this land, and next year we added another chunk of land, and et cetera, et cetera. But on the first premise, I think it also is doable to say, again, as an example, you run some of these new satellite analyses that are starting to happen more and more, and there's several of the entities down the valley that are doing more of this. We talked about semi-tropic, I think, in the past. I think some of the ones in Kauai Delta and others are doing some similar satellite-based approaches to analyzing. You could just say, here is our geographic area of the GSA, and in year X, the consumptive use is this number, broadly aggregated. The next year, it's a little bit less the next year, and that's what we're reporting to the state. It's just that aggregate number. We don't really care if it's your parcel or your parcel that reduced, but overall, we're seeing that roughly 2% reduction occurring in aggregate. That's all the state really cares about, if that makes sense. So I understand that trying to manage it to the parcel level adds burden. That's what we were talking about, the pros and cons there about allocations. There is a lot more administrative elements to that. But at the same time, we're not, doing some quick math. I just looked at in the 2015 acreage that was for the Madera subbasins, 85,000 acres. Again, I know I concentrate on that one more than Chowchilla just because those numbers are more in my head. 75% of those 85,000 acres are in permanent crops of some sort, vines, various trees, almonds, walnuts, figs, other things. So that's only 25% of that. There was a mention of let's just get pay the corn guys to stop growing. Well, tremendous amount of acreage is in permanent crops, so there's going to have to be a shift there. So what is that cost? How much are we going to need to do to be able to get to that point by 20 years from now of that shrinkage? And what you pay today, you may need to set it in a way that you pay that same amount for the next 20 years. Maybe there's the U.S. index for inflation or something adjusted, but otherwise you're going to have everybody hold out the last day to get the most money if there's some other way we have to try and address that. So those are some of the challenges with trying to look at it from a straight, I'm just going to pay and buy this land out, and then I'm going to add another chunk of land the next year and next year and next year. Is what is that dollar amount? How do we get there that gets us enough people to sign up, including out of that part of the 75% that are currently permanent crops?
Ralph, before I go back to you, is there anybody else on the committee that hasn't said anything that wants to chime in? Go ahead, Jared.
Just a point of clarification for Mike. A 218, that's a kind of more of a negative vote. So what's the threshold there for a 218 to fail?
Here, assuming that we have for water service, and there's some case law to the effect that this would be for water service, but basically you have to have notice to all the affected property owners. You have to have your hearing 45 days afterwards, and it's what's called a majority protest proceeding. If you have a majority of the submitted written protest, that can defeat the entire thing.
50 plus 1.
Yes.
Ralph?
Okay. Did Stephanie share my plan with you? Conceptually. Okay. We'll go into it a little more.
Conceptually.
Okay.
No, wait, remember,
but-
I made
well-
a scan of it. I
Well,
scanned it.
Well,
That's right.
Yeah.
So sorry, I apologize. I forget which came
Yeah.
from who, but yes, I did see a scan of a piece of paper with lots of numbers
Right, right.
and things.
Okay.
But
Well, to begin
sorry,
with,
I didn't mean.
okay. Did you understand them? Did you look at them?
I understood the concepts. I didn't try and run the math.
Okay, I ran the math. All right. The thing that we have to come, Stephanie and I, one day, we went and we figured it up. It was about 50-50 permanent crops and row crops. It was 50-50. It wasn't 75. It was, we need to recheck that if it is. We figured 50-50.
Yes, that's right. Just to be clear, we're talking about an impromptu meeting in my office where
Right.
I bring out a spreadsheet and quickly just
Yeah.
add a couple columns.
Okay, and we
Yeah.
came up with about half of that.
I-
All
I
right,
just-
well, we could recheck it. All right. Okay, I think what we need to do is not get all bundled up in legal stuff and things. We have to go back because, like, when you were in the 6th grade and they used to give you this math problem And in the math problem would be all this information that wasn't pertinent to you finding the answer. That's what we've got going on here. So what we need to do is figure out, what is the problem? The problem is that the groundwater level is dropping. All right. So what we've been asked to do is to stop it from dropping. We can do it very simply. We need to figure out a simple way of doing it that's fair. So when you do the legal scrutiny, it makes sense. So what my concept is not so much has anything to do with crops. What it basically is this: we have 175,000 acres of white area. 85,000 is irrigated agriculture. All the rest of the land, the grazing land, that doesn't mean anything. That's part of the problem that doesn't add to the solution. The half an acre foot of rain and all, that doesn't mean anything either. All that matters is that the ground level water does not drop and it has to come up. Any way we can figure out how to do that solves the problem. All right. So where does the solution fall to? The solution falls to the people that are pumping the water. The grazing guy, he didn't do anything. He's just growing grass. We're the ones causing the problem. Okay, we're the ones that have to come up with the solution. So what I think we should do is we should study doing an assessment that would cover enough money to retire an idle land. That's not buying the ranch. That's just paying the guy not to irrigate it that year. And I did the math, and if you got the paper, you can follow it. You've got 85,000 acres. You've got 42,500 acres of permanent crops. You have 85,000 acres being farmed. 85,000 acres at $50 an acre is $4,250,000 a year, year one. And this doesn't have to be implemented next year. It can be implemented 3 years from now as we study it. But we need to have a plan to quantify. The first year, 4,250,000. 5,000 acre feet is about 2,500 acres. 2 acre feet per acre. All right. 2,500 acres. What are we going to pay the guy to idle his ground? Well, if he's growing oats and wheat and this and that, sometimes they don't make any money. So I just used the math, and the numbers can change, but I used $100 an acre. $100 an acre is $250,000 to idle 2,500 acres. Of course, it'll be the ground that's being irrigated that's got alkali. Maybe his pump's no good. Maybe he can't get financing. So he says, I don't have enough of a budget to farm everything. I'll idle that piece. And I'm sure that the first years it's going to be easier to find the land, maybe that as you go down the road some. All right. So you have, after year one, complied, reduced 2,500 acres, and you have $4 million in reserve. With that $4 million, you could pay for your flood thing. You don't even have to build anything. That's just like a pittance, all right? $4 million in reserve. Year two, you do it again. But you don't have 85,000. You have 82,500 this time. So you're going to put in the bank $4,125,000. Now you've got $8,125,000. 5,000 acres comes out. Subtract $500,000 from that. You're still at $7.5 million after the second year. Reserve. Add another $4 million. See what I mean? So you're bringing it every year. You're adding 2,500 acres to it. At the end of year 5, you have over $16 million, and you retired over 10,000 acres of ground, and you've got $16 million, in which you may have to pay more than $100. You see? But what does it do? For $50 an acre, you get to keep pumping, and you get to keep. Now you got to study the groundwater level, how it's dropping. You got to do all these studies as they're occurring. But like Bill was saying, he said, I want to farm some more. All right. Well, maybe the first 3 years we start doing we check these things out. We study to find out what that number would be to idle land. And we may have to adjust the numbers, but the concept I think is sound. What we want is not someone to come and put a lock on your well. We don't want the state looking over our shoulders in our business. We want to have control of the money, and this thing won't be hard to administer, because the same project happened in the raisin bargaining thing when raisins were in oversupply. We took the problem and used the problem to solve the problem. We told the person, you leave that 40 acres out, I'll give you a piece of paper that says this is worth 80 tons of raisins. And you just don't produce, because we were producing raisins to feed them to the pigs. So I've had that experience. So what we need to do is have to come up with a plan that makes sense. We have to sell it to the Board of Supervisors. We have to talk it over. I hope we can talk it over here because we don't want to break some law. All right? Okay. And see what we come up with. I throw it to the group. What do you say?
Bill.
Yeah, I'm with Ralph. I'll take issue with some of his numbers, but the concept is sound. It is the concept that I have, and we came up on this kind of all on our own. But it makes perfect sense. The other thing I want to talk about, I wanted to address something Kevin brought up, and I'm going to be a little bit more direct than Kevin was, and I just want to be straight out. And my question is for Mike. If this basin was adjudicated, if this basin were to be adjudicated, and I had never been pumping water on my land, what would be the result of that in the adjudication?
I think the best thing I could tell you at this point is a possible result. The possible result, and this was written into the law that addressed adjudications after SGMA was put into place. It's in the new Code of Civil Procedure section, is that the rights, which are called dormant groundwater rights, you have them, but you've not been utilizing them. For this hypothetical, you have someone on a rangeland who has not been utilizing pumping groundwater for crops or anything. They're called dormant rights. They haven't been using them at all. And they can be subordinated. That's what the law provides. So what it's not where you would get maybe zero, but you may get a lot less than you otherwise would have under regular groundwater rights law, because under regular groundwater rights law, a dormant right is no different than an active right. It's correlative to everyone else in the basin. But if you have an adjudication and you have a situation where a landowner has not been using the overlying groundwater right, it can be subordinated, so it could end up with almost virtually nothing. So that's one possibility in an adjudication.
Do you have a legal opinion on what that possibility range would be? Like, is it 50-50 or is it like 90-10?
Considering our level of overdraft at one, and also considering that all of the pumping has gone on with persons exercising their rights, it would seem to me anyway, this is just an opinion. It's considering that we've never had adjudications around here, that's one thing. So we don't have a local history of that. But it would seem to me it would be less than 50%.
Yeah, I would hazard a guess that it would be very, very slight. And so with that regard, I believe that to have a native land yield of water would be counterproductive to what the county's trying to do. And more about this discussion on incentive, those of us with permanent crops, we just need a little bit of time. I got 10-year-old almonds. Hey, give me 5 more years. I'll take them out. But don't Don't kill me. No, 10 years would be wonderful, but I may not get 10 years. But if you allocate 2 acre-feet per acre next year, I'm done. I'm done. Allocation of water on a per acre basis is insane for the Madera County to try and contemplate how that would be administered. It'd be almost impossible. You talk to Fox Canyon again today and find out how that's going down there. We have a perfect pilot project to watch. We cannot try and reinvent that wheel. So I've very, very strong feelings about this idea and concept of trying to allocate water on a per acre and to administer water on a parcel by parcel basis. I think would be next to impossible, and it would not be productive to what the county's trying to accomplish as far as minimizing economic harm. I just need time. I need some time, and I'll take my permanent crop will be termed out, and then I might lease my land out to somebody, to the GSA, and just leave it sit idle and put a conservation easement on it and get paid for carbon credits by growing native grass on it. Who knows what's going to happen? But to try and do something and box us in, the description to box us into something immediately it just doesn't make any sense to me.
One of the things, Bill, that you're saying, and I'm not saying I don't agree with you, I don't think it's the goal of the committee today to make any recommendation. I think looking at what we're seeing, I believe, and this is just my opinion, that we're going to end up with some kind of hybrid, not just one thing. So I'm not saying, but I think what we have to do, and Stephanie, this is, if we can look and do some numbers based on what Ralph has discussed, then that's something that we can bring back at our next meeting to discuss and see what we can do. But to another point you made, Bill, regarding being able to monitor this, I've agreed with you. I know it's going to be a challenge, but sitting at a meeting this morning regarding Landsat and some of this other technology that is being used and is being used very efficiently within, I think, 1% to 2%, and the state is buying off on it. So to say that, we have to remember, we're looking at periods of time, but the technology that is coming down the pipeline is going to catch up very quickly. So I think, I am, and I think most of us are of the opinion that we have to do this as slowly as we possibly can, but we have to keep the state out, and also we have to make sure that everybody in the GSP is gonna be okay with it. If we don't have a coordinated agreement, it stops there. So I think that technology is coming along to where we are going to be able to monitor things a lot quicker than any of us realize. So with that, Ralph, I'll go back to you.
Okay, all right. Yeah, to speak to some other issues. Okay, this plan that is in my head that we should do, it doesn't say we're going to pull out permanent crops. You don't have to do that. This plan is to keep agriculture, permanent crops here growing because it's part of the economy. Our economy here depends on permanent crops, maybe a little bit more than it does field crops. But the market will find itself at what price they'll idle their land. And they will, it's not a burdensome task once you get the people that have decided to idle that 160 and that 60 and that 300. It doesn't take much. You could, like you say, you can do it with a satellite. You can see what's not being farmed, or you could just send someone out there in a couple, 2-3 days. They verify it. It's done. We got to make things where they're cost effective, efficient. And maybe instead of hiring new people, we ought to get some of the people that are working in the county to take on the job. Because I went in your office and I see about 5 people and they're talking and they're having a good time. And there's a lot of stuff that can be going on. We can allocate some jobs to them. See, so because you want to save monies, all right? But the other thing that can happen is this. We have to be cognizant that we have this other program where people need wells and water systems, and their domestic wells are going out. Maybe as part of this money that we collect, all right, we can allow some of that money to be used to hire someone to get grant money for these people. You know, maybe it's what we decide we want to do with it. The other thing politically with the MID is the heart of the whole thing, because the MID's got the system where all the canals come in, the water comes in, they have access. So we in the white area are going to have to make partnership agreements with the MID for recharge. We're going to have to get together and say, we will take on that 100 acres over there on that sandy piece of ground next to your canal system. We're going to lease that independent of what we're doing with the fee. And when the water's available, we're going to help put water in the ground under your base, under your MID, so you can't say that we're robbing the water from you. Any claim they make that you're taking water from them, either before it gets to them or after they put it in the ground, you make them good on it. You just do some projects with them. And we got to get them on our side.
And I would not disagree with you that MID is a key component to this, but I don't think we should limit ourselves just to one option. I think there are going to be multiple options. I mean, we have Doug Welsh in the room from Chowchilla Water District. Maybe there's stuff that we can do with them. I mean, water is moving everywhere. And I think there's going to be opportunity to buy water. And this might be one of those years where there could be spill risk in San Luis. And we might be able to do exchanges with, I'm not saying that MID wouldn't be key, but, what happens to other people in the sub-basin? What about Triangle T or someone else like that, where we as a committee or a group can buy water and deliver it there and get the credits this side. Now,
the white area.
That's all concept, and that's one of the things that I've discussed with Stephanie is we really need to look, because water's been flowing for quite some time and this year, and there is going to be spill risk this year, I believe, in San Luis. So I think if we can start laying the groundwork for possibly buying water and delivering it elsewhere and being able to, and obviously we have to pay for it, and there would have to be a charge, a fee, a tax, whatever is necessary. I think we have to be, I don't want us as the committee just to focus in on one solution. There's a broad, we still have a ways to go on this. And let's remind ourselves now, for the plan, we do not have to have these intricate details. Obviously, we want to put this out as soon as possible, but it's not necessary to have those specific details in the plan that has to be submitted in the next couple months. I think I've heard many of you say, and I agree, that we probably don't want to put those details in just yet, because then you are, in fact, boxing yourself in. So I like our discussion. I think it's healthy, but some of this stuff we're going to have to agree to disagree, and at some point we all have to make a recommendation. I don't think today's the day, and I would say we have staff has more to do, and obviously that's not going to stop. So with that, Ralph?
Yeah, I would say, you know what? When you're trying to create a concept, the best way to demonstrate the concept is through an example. So you need to quantify the concept. even if it's not the right numbers exactly, at least you see how it works. And I think to that argument, you do need to kind of quantify. I do have a question for Mike. Mike, have you guys got any feedback from the Board of Supervisors? Are they not? Would you, in your estimation, Stephanie, said they are very knowledgeable on this Sigma thing, or they're kind of like this? They're not really knowledgeable.
I think that they're very knowledgeable, and they're certainly as knowledgeable as the MID board.
Okay, so is it legal for us to approach these people and talk to them about different ideas?
You can always talk to your board of supervisors.
Okay.
Yes, your constituent.
I don't want to break any laws.
Bill?
Yeah, I just want to say that I don't disagree with you. I think Landsat and Land IQ and you definitely have to measure how much water a grower is using, especially, almonds. I know I'm probably guilty of using more water than anybody else on their almonds, and I know guys that are growing almonds on 2.5, 3 feet, and we grow almonds with more water than that. So, yeah, there's a certain amount of measurements going to have to come to, especially if we can figure out how to justify a tiered rate which will benefit, and of course that the administrative fee for the GSA is going to be paid in there somewhere, and apparently that's a separate Prop 218 election and calculation.
So the fee to run the GSA just goes to a vote of the Board of Supervisors.
Very good. And we can't. Oh man, I wish that we could do rates that way also, but I still believe that there's a way to justify a tiered rate, because when you put the value of the replacement water on that water that's being pumped out, you watch what happens to those tiered rates.
I also think that there's a way to justify tiered rates, but I think that it needs careful consideration, and that we would need to look very carefully at tying the cost to each tier.
And the object of my argument is that we buy the permanent crop time, guys' time. And I love what Ralph said. We don't want to retire permanent cropland, but I think unless we can get a boatload of water into this GSA, that is going to be our reality in 2040. But I need time. I need time to retire those almonds, and I will retire them, because between 18 and 20 years old, they're done.
But I hear that, but I also drive around and see a lot of baby almonds, right? So
mine will come out, and those will come in.
And there's no net change. That's the concern, right?
Well, the net change is what we had argued about. Is it, how are you going to be able to pump 2 feet of water to grow? Unfortunately, it's going to be tough.
So if just I want to add a couple of things for consideration in the discussion, and on top of Ralph's point here, and others about we got to preserve the permanent crops. I think it's important to recognize that a lot of this GSA's acreage in annual crops, especially corn and hay and silage, associates with dairy operations, which are also using, that ground has to stay in production for other reasons as part of nutrient management and all the other things. So it's not likely that that's just going to come right out of ground without having a whole ripple effect to the dairy industry itself. So I think that just has to be considered as to whether we can just take these other crops out. Also, when I look at the 2015 acreage, I appreciate the math, and I appreciate the point that the math has to continue to be refined and such, that the 42,000 acres approximately that you've recognized is only the 2015 acreage in almonds and pistachios. When you add grapes, when you add citrus and tropical, when you add the miscellaneous deciduous, which, figs or some other things like that, the total acreage from the 2015 Ag Commissioner's report that was then distributed onto this portion of the GSA based on all the satellite stuff and analysis they did is about 65,000 acres. Of that 85,000 is in some sort of permanent crop. So the reason why I want to bring that up is because I do think it affects the price significantly.
Changes
About
the numbers.
It changes the numbers, and and for better or worse, it just changes the numbers.
Just
And I think that
changes the
just has to be
numbers, yeah.
understood and recognized that that does mean you probably have to take permanent crops out sooner than you might be needing time for.
Before I go to Stephanie, I want to come back to you on, and you were saying you could put together something based on the tiered rates. Is that something that would, I mean, I know the numbers would be, is there something you think that we could look at with that?
Well, it would require a spreadsheet. To be clear, we're back at spreadsheet world, right? Which was
Right.
May 17th and 23rd, which I thought was tough.
Right.
So,
Well, and then I would go back to the committee on that, is if the committee wanted to see something based on that, then that is something we can discuss up here. But
We may want to have public comment before we come back to the committee
right,
for any recommendation.
Kevin had something to say, so.
Can you guys change the lighting next time? It makes my bald spot look bigger. Just wondering.
Hey, you need to wear a hat. That's
Yeah,
all.
that's just a couple thoughts. I'm scared to death of adjudication, and I have a sense of urgency in getting something that the state will accept in 4 or 6 months from now, whenever that is. And I think this has been a really good discussion about different concepts, and then Greg's comments on how what we wind up with may be a hybrid. I think is really good advice. But I also want to remind everybody that whatever we start with in 2020 doesn't have to be what we wind up with in 2025 or 2040. So my suggestion is that we come up with something that allows us to get around the 218 rules. And maybe it's something like what Ralph and Bill are talking about. So we are not found out of compliance. And when we start down that process and we start to retire some land, I agree. I think the numbers may be higher that we would have to pay in rent, so it might not be as many acres. But at least we get started. And if we don't start doing that right away, that's some banking term for lost opportunity. I can't think of what it's called. So why not start building up our war chest, and so we can do a project. And you know what? If we only retire 1,000 acres instead of 2,500, well, what the hell? It's better than nothing. So I would like to encourage us as a group and staff to try to come up with something that we can do now, as opposed to Landsat may be the thing, but I'm not sure that we're going to feel warm and fuzzy about doing that in 6 months. I think there's going to be issues with it still, and it's going to be probably litigated. But the consequences are extreme. I mean, Madera County is the biggest, not a lot of acres, but Madera County is the biggest fig growing county in the United States. And I've got 850 people picking figs today.
That's a
850. And with the other growers, it probably puts us up close to 1,200. And if we have to idle half of our acres, 600 jobs just went away. And that's just figs, small components. So I state that to try to convey the sense of urgency in doing something, and let's get started now. Thank you.
With that, we can always circle back to the committee, so I'm going to open this up for public comment. Does anybody have any public comment? Seeing none, Wayne?
It seems like just looking some common sense, simple things at what is really happening in our world out there. Why are we even talking that much about pasture land if they can't pump water anyway? If there's either bedrock under there, sands go dry. It seems to me that that's really confusing the issue on that point. There's been a lot of talk about how to take land out of production, how to make jobs go away. Catching runoff, a natural thing for the pasture folks is that water that falls up there. Well, I have a ranch that I have flooding happen about every 3 years. It's on an arroyo. The water comes down off of pasture land and moves right along to the San Joaquin River and is gone. Capturing the water that's going to waste to hold some of those, I think, is ultimately going to be really important to us. Almonds do have a relatively short lifespan. Encouraging alternate crops, getting out of crops in our area that take the largest amounts of water, many different approaches, everything we can do to solve this problem and keep land in beneficial production. And as far as the tiered rates, I'd say, again, in the real world, what is going to happen? We're going to take the low-hanging fruit first, which is going to be relatively inexpensive. It's not going to get us to where we're going to need to be, so we're going to have to go to more expensive measures to get that fruit that's a little higher up. And ultimately, 20 years from now, we're going to have to be getting some up there in those trees to get what we can. So right there, I think you have justification for tiered rates. Thank you.
Thank you, Wayne. Any other public comment?
Had enough.
Okay, so I'm going to hold off on. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry about that. Madeline Harris from Leadership Council. So I have a few questions and a few comments mixed in there. So as far as the decisions that you all are making and the comment that you made earlier regarding not wanting to get boxed in, I did want to encourage you to not wait until the last minute to make some of those decisions just for the sake of public process. I know that we'll get the 3-month comment period once the full GSP is released, but just to be able to participate and bring the public into those decisions as they're being made. That's something that you all referenced being aware of earlier. I also wanted to clarify, maybe this isn't, worked out either in the ideas that you've discussed or the decisions that you did thus far, but clarify where the funds would be coming from that would pay growers to retire the land, whether that would be something that taxpayers would be funding or pay each other. Okay. So that was one clarification I wanted to make. And then I was also curious about the possibility of some sort of economic analysis about retiring certain crops over others, an economic analysis, and then also logical analysis, I suppose, seeing as though, for instance, almonds are mechanized, so I don't know if they have as many jobs as, say, figs, which would still be picked by hand as far as I understand. And I also know that almonds tend to be water intensive, so comparing, certain crops in making them. So those were a couple things I was curious about.
The comment I would make, and Stephanie, this is where I'll let you back me up and jump in at any time. But as far as the plan goes, I don't believe we're going to have a lot of the details to put into the plan. This is still going to be worked on. The plan will be submitted, and we will still be working on the details. Stephanie, would you like to weigh in on that as well?
Sure. I think that the groundwater sustainability plan needs to be turned in with a coordination agreement before the deadline. And that is the #1 priority of probably everybody in this room. In there, we need strategies, but some of the details of those strategies are probably not going to be fully formulated. And I would say that's probably okay. That goes back to slide 1. We want certainty. And we have a little bit of uncertainty, but we have to learn to live with that in order to be flexible.
And all of this will be vetted. I mean, all this has to be done in public. So
Yep. And
we,
oh, go ahead, Devin. Sorry.
we want as much time. I mean, it's not like we want to delay this any more than we have to, but I don't want us to rush to make any decision. We have to think through it because we're going to be stuck with this for at least a year. Stephanie?
I was just going to add that the David's engineering team that's doing the joint GSP has an economist, an ag economist on the team.
So that is, they are doing something related. Any other comment?
Not so far. Thank you.
I'd like to answer a question.
Go ahead.
You want to know if I get it right, you're interested in knowing if we're going to have somebody tell us what we should pull out, what we should keep, and all of that. Was that what your concern was?
Not necessarily. I guess I'm more curious about conducting on the front end an analysis of the economic impacts and also the impacts to groundwater usage of retiring certain crops over others,
Okay.
especially as relates to the suggestion about crop conversion.
I'll answer that for you. The farmer's going to make it. Because when the parameters come in as to what he has to deal with to survive when he's operating, he's going to make the decision what crops he's taking out, how much risk he's willing to do, and he's going to make those decisions. It's not the Soviet Union. They're not going to come and say, well, you know what? We don't want. I've learned something the other day. Let me tell you what I learned. I was talking to a guy, and he told me he's in the business of dealing in cigars. Okay, in cigars. And we're talking about Cuban cigars because they're supposed to be the best, right? Well, they used to be the best before communism came. When communism came, Fidel Castro insisted that all the people that grew tobacco had to leave half of their land, grow sugar beets, because the government and him made money on sugar. So he made the farmers stop growing the tobacco and start growing half of the land in sugar beets. Well, the farmers that were the good tobacco farmers, they left Cuba and they went to Nicaragua, they went to Honduras, they went to those countries in Central America, and they started new farms. All right? They found the same conditions and everything. And that's where the best cigars are made now. Because the government start telling the farmers how to do things. So that's what we don't want here. That's why we're trying to figure it out.
Noted. Thank you. Thank you.
Any other public comment? And Ralph, maybe you should buy her a Nicaraguan cigar
I don't know.
and bring it to the next meeting.
Okay.
Seeing no other public comment, we're going to go to the director's report and then we'll come back for any additional committee member comments.
So we have a couple of items here which I wanted to just bring to your attention. The first is we have talked about how folks who have livestock have some unique concerns. And there's the potential to do an ad hoc committee. So it would be members of this advisory committee, a certain couple who have livestock interests and interest in talking about that could meet on their own as an ad hoc. So that's kind of issue one. We could do something with that. Issue two, as a county agency, we can go out with an RFQ, RFP, and get some quotes and look at products that could use Landsat technology, and then we could get a gauge of level of accuracy. You know, I've heard some presentations with Greg, and I'm sure you all have too. We're popular with salespeople, but we may be able to get some proposals on that, and we could do that in July. That would give us some gauge of the level of accuracy that we're dealing with and the cost as well. And I wanted to note, just because county staff smile and laugh at work doesn't mean they're not working, Mr. Pistoresi.
What was that? Well, you were working and I was watching. So I got
Yeah, there are a fair amount of characters that stop by our offices.
I would say that we should proceed with both of those. And as far as the livestock, Ben, would you be willing to do that? I would say if we could, Ben Clay and then Bryant Elkins. Is that something that you could reach out to the three of them?
Yes, absolutely.
Ben's already committed, so.
And Clay and Bryant aren't here, so
Right.
following the rule that if you're not here, you get selected.
Okay, then we will appoint them.
Right. They've been appointed. Yeah, and I'll
well-
bring it back as an item at the next meeting.
Do I have to participate in that one?
I don't think so.
I like that. Okay, thank you. From that finishes your report.
Yes.
From there, we'll come back to committee member comments. Bill?
Yeah, I just wanted to address Madeline briefly. There's a process taking place right now called the San Joaquin Valley Blue Ribbon
Blueprint.
And I think the Leadership Council and Self-Help has been engaged in that. There's going to be a very extensive economic analysis done through the Blue Ribbon process that probably will be a composite of all the counties, and it might be pretty meaningful for you. And I encourage Self-Help and Leadership Council to engage in that process. I know that they've been approached and encourage you to participate because that process is going to need cooperation from everybody in the valley. And that also is a tremendous concern, I know, for the domestic wells and the small agencies, small water systems, on how the mitigation is going to be administered. The state has got $130 million a year continuously appropriated, and how that gets from there to there is the problem. And so I just wanted to make everybody aware of that, we can say we're going to mitigate, and saying it and making it happen is two different things. Anyhow, that's it. Thanks.
Well, and I think part of the plan that's going to come from this committee and part of these charges or fees is going to have to be inclusive of mitigation. And what I think is we're going to have to be a little bit more proactive. It became very clear at our last meeting, and Leadership Council did make the point of, if you are continuing to pump, which we will, wells are going to go dry. That to the person who has the well that went dry, saying you're going to supply them water at some point in time, that's something we want to try to avoid. I know this is going to be calculated into the fee when we finally get the rate analysis and so forth. But is there, regarding that mitigation process, I know as growers, we do pump tests on wells. And I know you can do pump tests on domestic wells. I know there's a bunch of them out there, and that's going to cost money. But is that something that we could consider as part of the mitigation, is doing more pump tests on some of these, on domestic wells, to see if maybe they need to be extended or re-drilled? We can find that, be proactive on that versus waiting for them to go dry.
Yes, so we're actively discussing well mitigation and what that might look like. And we're also engaged with legal counsel doing that work too, because it runs into some issues with being a gift of public funds, right? So we need to figure out a way to do that. But as we've noted, there is funds available from the state. So we may be able to be an intermediary there to get people the help that they need. And of course, when a well goes dry, it's an emergency. Absolutely. And it's, it's something with a short-term fix, which is you need to have a tank and water in the tank, and you also need bottled water. And then it's something where there's a longer-term fix with a permit to deepen the well or to connect to a system. So it's a big deal. Yeah.
Thank you.
I have a question about that, about this well thing. Okay, say you have these people that they're out there and their well goes dry, right? It seems like our conversation here is that we are 100% responsible for their well going dry. When my well goes dry, I'm responsible for my well going dry. Nobody pays for my well. I fix my well, or I have to figure something out. We need to come up with something that makes sense, not just we're going to just drill everybody a well, because you'll go broke. You need to figure it out. I mean, I can see putting money that we collect among ourselves. We have millions of dollars. We hire someone to get grant money. If the state wants to drill their well, since it's a socialist state, let's let the state drill them the wells, okay? And we'll just keep paying the guys to idle the ground.
Come with me to Sacramento, Ralph.
Yeah, I'll come with
I need you in my back pocket.
I'll come.
And Ralph, I am in no way suggesting that we should pay for everything. But what I am saying is there are undesirable results that are occurring. We, as the committee and growers, have to mitigate that. If we do not, the state of California will come in.
Why don't we loan them the money to drill the well? We'll loan them the money.
Why don't we agendize this item?
Okay. That sounds great.
Okay, thank you.
From that, do we have any other comments from the committee?
Yeah.
It seems like there's a fair bit of support for the concept that Ralph and Bill are talking about. The numbers in my mind that he presented don't work and wouldn't work. I think all of us who are farming are going to have to put up more per acre than has been suggested, and we're going to have to pay as an incentive considerably more than was suggested to get people to go take a seat and quit pumping water. But I think if you can run some analysis that would recognize maybe what some lease, typical lease payments would be that a grower might be foregoing by idling his land. In other words, he's going to lease it to us rather than lease it to his neighbor. We could probably evaluate whether the economics will support the theory that he's presented. And I'm not suggesting that they won't. In fact, I think they probably will. I don't think we need the reserves for the infrastructure projects to be quite as large as the example presented. I know just as ourselves, without any help, we've put in infrastructure projects here. What, Phil, the last 2 years maybe? We're importing water into wide areas and irrigating 4,000 acres. We've funded those projects. They're not nearly as expensive as we're all suggesting here. I'm hoping that growers could do that without paying prevailing wages and then come to the group to be reimbursed and avoid the obligation for prevailing wages. Do we have any sense of that? It's something that would be worth looking into. I mean, obviously, had we had to pay prevailing wages, we would have done a great deal less than we did. Thank you.
Ralph.
You should have never put me on this committee. Well, you know what? The numbers might change, Jim. It might change. Maybe not. Because when you go, people lease land. They had $200 an acre. They lease it to the guy. Now, part of the thing I forgot to mention is I think the county should not charge the guy property tax on the land that he's helping solve the county's water problem. Because the county's part of this too, right?
Well, so I'm just referring to my notes. Earlier, you said we're the ones causing the problem.
Who's causing it, Brian?
You said we're the ones causing
we're,
the problem.
Well, we're part of the ones, but there's a lot of people in the city. There's a lot. How many city walls are there in the city?
I don't know.
Well, I bet you there's about 50 of them. And so,
95% of the water used in Madera County is for ag.
right, but there's still, whatever it is, the city's doing it, or the county's doing it. I didn't say the city, the county. But if it's a county GSA, right, and the white area, we're the white area, is the city part of the white area, or is it separate?
The city's its own GSA.
Oh, well, then it's got to pay. It should pay too. Not the city, the county. The county.
With that, before I adjourn the meeting, I just want to again reiterate to Greg, Stephanie, Mike, we appreciate all the work that you are putting into this, and also to all of us up here on the committee. Ralph, thank you for all your concept and everything else. I mean, we are making progress. We're gonna not completely agree. We're gonna agree to disagree, but I think we're moving in the right direction. You know, working together with MID, Wichita Water District, with everybody that's in our basin to keep as much water here as we possibly can is our goal. So with that, thanks to everybody, and thanks to all of you in the room, because there's a lot of people that are here consistently, and we appreciate that and appreciate the feedback. With that, we will be adjourned. Thank you.